You bet we can go. Let's hurry and get ready.
Most people think Betty Boop was one of the most innocent cartoons ever made. She wasn't. A few of her cartoons are so dark they could never be made today. And once you know why, you can't unsee it. There's a secret buried in her history that changes every single scene.
The old man of the mountain.
And the woman behind that famous wink? Officially, she was only 16. Stick around. By the end, you'll never look at Betty the same. 20 things about Betty Boop you only understand as an adult. Her cartoons were never really for children. Most people assume Betty Boop was made for kids. She wasn't. Not even close. Betty's world wasn't a meadow or a candy land.
There's the moon, way up high. Here are you and here am I.
It was speakeasies, smoky jazz clubs, and cabaret stages. The adult underbelly of the Roaring '20s and the Depression that followed. She performed for rooms full of grown men during the wildest party era in American history. This one fact rewires everything you're about to hear. A wink in a children's cartoon is cute. The same wink delivered on a nightclub stage to an audience of adults means something completely different. So every gag, every gesture, every plot you half remember from Betty Boop, you were watching adult entertainment that happened to be drawn. And the very first thing those adult audiences noticed is the thing that drives nearly every story she's in. Why man chase her? Go back and actually count it. Short after short, the engine of the plot is identical. A man, sometimes a whole crowd of them, fixated on Betty.
Do you like your job?
Watching her undress, following her home, cornering her, trying to get her alone. As a kid, you read it as the boys like Betty. Sweet, harmless. As an adult, you notice how relentless it is. How rarely Betty gets to simply live her own life without being pursued. It isn't one creepy side character, it's the entire architecture of her world. Men want her, and the story is usually about what they're willing to do to get her. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why was a cartoon drawn in a way that practically invited it? That was no accident. Designed to attract adults. Here's the tell. Line Betty up next to other cartoon women from the exact same years. Minnie Mouse. The rest of them.
Don't take my boo-boo-ba-doo-ba away.
Almost all were drawn cute, round, and childlike, deliberately sexless. Now look at Betty. Short skirt, high heels, a garter, a low, contoured top built to emphasize her figure. She wasn't drawn like a cartoon character. She was drawn like a pin-up calendar that learned to walk. This was calculated. Every other studio aimed its female characters at children. Betty's animators aimed her squarely at grown men. And it worked. She stood out precisely because she was the only one in the room with the body of an adult woman. But the studio didn't stop at how she looked. They hid things in the writing too. Things you were never meant to catch as a kid. Jokes kids could never catch. And here's your first big payoff. Watch a Betty Boop cartoon as a child and you see slapstick, bouncy music, silly faces, things falling over.
Come on and join me with boopy-doopy-doopy-doop, boop-boopy-doop.
Watch the exact same cartoon as an adult and a second movie appears that was hiding in plain sight the entire time. The innuendo, the double meanings, the wait, did they really just imply that? Moments stitched into the dialogue and the background. The animators were writing two cartoons at once, a goofy one on the surface and a winking, adults-only one underneath.
You didn't miss those jokes because you were slow. You missed them because they were engineered to be missed by you and caught by your dad. But none of that is the fact I warned you about in the intro. That one is next, and it changes everything. She was a teenager.
When old gloom comes round, you don't have to frown. It won't mean nothing, just boopy-doopy-doopy-doop, boop-boopy-doo.
This is it, the fact I promised you. In the world of the cartoons, Betty Boop was not a grown woman. She was 16. Now reload everything from the last 2 minutes. The pin-up body, the nightclub stages, the grown men relentlessly chasing her, the adults-only jokes written into her shorts. She was written as a teenager. This single detail is the dividing line between how a child sees Betty and how an adult sees her. As a kid, you literally can't process it. As an adult, you can't unsee it. It quietly recolors every cartoon she ever appeared in, and it's why some fans say they can never watch her the same way again.
You go back to bed. I want to hear a story.
Hold on to that number. 16. Because the deeper into this list we go, the more it's gonna matter. Inspired by America's Bad Girls. Betty wasn't just a pretty face. She was a provocation. The animators built her on the flapper. The young women of the 1920s who chopped off their hair, raised their hemlines, smoked, drank in public, and danced in ways that horrified their parents. To older generations, flappers were living proof that society was collapsing. So the studio didn't reach for a wholesome girl next door. They deliberately modeled their star on the single most controversial type of woman in America, the one fathers warned their sons about, and built a whole series around her.
In an equatorial climb, there's a beautiful isle where movie stars...
That's the part people forget. Betty wasn't accidentally edgy. Edgy was the entire product. And one of the strangest ways they made her feel real was by smuggling actual living celebrities into her cartoons. And you've almost certainly never noticed. A real jazz legend hidden. One of the strangest things ever hidden inside a Betty Boop cartoon wasn't drawn at all. It was a real living human being. In the cartoon Minnie the Moocher, there's a ghostly walrus that glides through a haunted cave, moving in a way that feels uncannily, impossibly human. That's because it was human. The studio used a trick called rotoscoping, filming a real performer, then tracing over the footage frame by frame. That walrus was traced directly from Cab Calloway, one of the biggest jazz stars on the planet performing live. His real body, his real moves, buried inside a cartoon ghost. Adults in 1932 recognized him in a heartbeat. They were watching a superstar smuggled into what looked like a children's cartoon. Kids just saw a spooky walrus. That gap, what the grown-ups caught versus what the kids saw, is this whole video in a nutshell. And the biggest thing the grown-ups knew? Betty wasn't even born human. Started as dog. Not a metaphor, an actual dog. When Betty first appeared in 1930, she had long, floppy poodle ears and a round black poodle snout instead of a nose. Anatomically, she was a French poodle that happened to stand upright and bat her eyelashes. Then the animators did something sneaky. Over a single year, they slowly morphed her.
Can't you see the love light in my eyes?
The ears shrank into hoop earrings, the snout shrank into a button nose, until every trace of the dog was gone and the woman on your coffee mug was born. So that icon? She's a poodle that evolved into a pinup. And now remember what I told you a minute ago, that she's officially 16. Keep both of those in your head at once. Because from here, this list stops being quirky and starts getting genuinely dark. Her cartoons hid genuinely nightmarish imagery.
We're detectives nowadays.
Betty's most famous cartoons aren't remembered for being cute. They're remembered for being disturbing. In one short, skeletons rise from their graves and dance through a moonlit cemetery while a ghostly figure chases Betty through a warping, melting nightmare. In another, the walls breathe, ordinary objects come alive, and the whole world bends like a fever dream, years before anyone used the word psychedelic. The studio used the cartoon format as cover to put strange, adult, almost hallucinatory ideas on screen that no live-action film could have gotten away with.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you.
Death, ghosts, temptation, the supernatural, all aimed at adults who were in on it. Kids found it spooky fun, adults found it unsettling on a level kids couldn't reach. But the most jaw-dropping thing about Betty isn't what's in her cartoons, it's what she did to the people watching them. And if you think those nightmare cartoons were strange, wait until you hear why parents across 1930s America became convinced Betty Boop was actively corrupting their daughters. We are getting there, and it's uglier than you'd expect. First though, we need to talk about the lawsuit that nearly erased Betty from history before she ever got famous. Why two women tried to stop Betty Boop. One woman was so convinced Betty Boop had stolen her identity that she dragged an entire movie studio into court. Because Betty was assembled, almost like a Frankenstein, from two real celebrities. Her look came from Clara Bow, the original It Girl, the biggest sex symbol of the silent era.
All by myself in the night.
Her voice and her squeaky little catchphrase came from a singer named Helen Kane. And the resemblance was so blatant that Kane was the one who sued, claiming the studio had stolen her entire act. So who won? Kane lost. The judge ruled that the baby voice style wasn't uniquely hers to own, partly because she may have lifted it from another performer first. Betty Boop was, legally, a copy of a copy that nobody could claim, which means the most famous flapper in history belonged to no one and was about to become bigger than all of them. Speaking of which, we've reached the top 10. Top 10 starts now. Everything you've heard so far explains why Betty Boop became famous. The next 10 explain why people with real power tried to erase her completely. First major sex symbol animation. Remember that coffee mug from the very beginning of this video? The cute, harmless little Betty printed on it is about to become the most controversial cartoon woman in America. We throw the phrase sex symbol around today, but someone had to be the first one in animation history. It was her.
Well, Grampy, what are you gonna do about it?
No cartoon woman before Betty came anywhere close. She wasn't comic relief or a sidekick. She was the headline act. Men went to theaters specifically to see her. She received fan mail. She got top billing. In every meaningful sense, she was a movie star who happened to be made of ink and paint. Sit with how strange that is. The first animated sex symbol in history is the same face now sold as wholesome, retro, grandma-friendly merchandise in mall gift shops. And don't forget what we established earlier. The first animated sex symbol in history wasn't even written as a grown woman. She was officially 16. But sex symbol is the polite version of Betty's story, because in a couple of her cartoons, the studio crossed a line that today is almost impossible to watch. Quick question before I show you. How many of these facts did you already know? Drop the number in the comments, because this next one is the fact that changed how I see Betty Boop forever. Built around workplace sexual harassment. In a short called Boop Boop-a-Doop, Betty works at a circus. Her boss, the ringmaster, wants her, and he makes his move in the most chilling way imaginable. He corners her alone in her tent. He puts his hands on her, and he makes it brutally clear: give in to him or lose your job. He even asks her, to her face, whether she likes working there. That's not innuendo anymore. That's a textbook depiction of a boss coercing an employee for sex. In a cartoon, in 1932. Betty pleads with him to stop, begging him in song not to take her Boop Boop-a-Doop away, the short's barely veiled stand-in for her dignity. She's rescued at the last second. But sit with the fact that this was the premise. A studio looked at workplace coercion and thought, there's our next family cartoon. And this is where the whole story splits in two. Here's the question people still can't agree on, almost a century later. Was Betty Boop empowering? A woman holding her own against predatory men? Or was she being exploited? A teenage character put in danger for an audience that enjoyed watching it? Hold that question, because the answer is coming, and the next cartoon is the one that makes it almost impossible to answer. Stages an attempted assault.
I hope you enjoyed the ball.
In a short called Chestnuts, a villainous king sets his sights on Betty. When she turns him down, he refuses to accept it. He ties her up. Then he drags her toward the bedroom, telling her flatly that he will have her. Now remember the number I asked you to hold on to, 16. This is exactly why that earlier fact lands so differently for adults. As a kid, it's a goofy rescue scene with bouncy music. As an adult who knows how she's written, it's an attempted kidnapping and assault of a teenage character, staged as Saturday morning entertainment. Betty fights him off, screams for help out the window, and is saved before anything happens. The cartoon plays it as adventure. Strip away the music and you're left with something no studio could release today. And disturbingly, the studio didn't treat these as one-offs. They built whole cartoons around seduction and temptation, and one of them barely hides it at all. A veiled seduction story. In this short, a mysterious man lives alone on a mountain, and every single woman in the nearby town is obsessed with him. That's the plot. An entire town of women drawn helplessly toward one magnetic stranger, until Betty herself climbs the mountain to face him. As a kid, a weird little adventure. As an adult, it's a barely disguised story about temptation, where the danger of the mysterious man is the entire appeal. And the women's fascination is played for something far more knowing than innocent. The subtext isn't buried. It's right there in how every woman in town reacts the second he appears. This was the kind of content pouring out of the studio by the early 1930s. And the strangest part of all of it is what Betty became because of it. Betty refused to do what powerful men wanted. And here's the answer to the question I left hanging back at the circus tent. Empowering or exploited? The honest answer is, somehow, both at once. And that contradiction is the whole reason she still matters. Here's the twist nobody at the studio intended. In every one of those cartoons, Betty doesn't give in. The ringmaster threatens her, she refuses. The king grabs her, she fights, screams, and escapes. Again and again, powerful men try to take her, and again she says no and survives with her dignity intact. Nobody set out to make a statement. The studio just wanted a pretty girl in peril and a hero to swoop in. But the side effect was a character who repeatedly refuses to be owned by powerful men. Decades before that was a conversation happening out loud anywhere in America. So Betty became something her creators never planned, a symbol of a woman who would not submit. And that, not the short skirts, not the wink, is what made her a genuine threat. Because the people about to come after her weren't bothered by sex alone. They were bothered by a woman who simply would not behave. That defiance is what made the most powerful moral forces in the country decide this cartoon had to be erased. The Censorship War. What happened next is the part almost nobody knows. A flirty cartoon flapper became one of the single biggest targets of an organized campaign to clean up Hollywood. Not a movie star, a drawing. The groups that wanted Betty Boop erased. By the early 1930s, a coalition of religious organizations had had enough of Hollywood. The most powerful of them formed what was called the Legion of Decency, and they wielded a terrifying weapon: the power to order millions of churchgoers to boycott any film they condemned. A single condemnation could wipe out a movie's box office overnight. And out of every target in America, every scandalous actor, every racy film, every real human behaving badly, one of the faces they singled out as a symbol of moral rot was a cartoon. Think about how extreme that is. They looked at Betty Boop, a drawing made of ink, and decided she was dangerous. Not silly, not tasteless, dangerous. To them, she wasn't just suggestive. She was a teenage cartoon flapper beamed into every theater in the country, teaching millions of young women exactly the wrong lessons. She was living proof, they believed, that Hollywood was poisoning the morals of the nation, and she had to be dealt with. For a while, they could only complain, but that was about to change, because these groups were finally about to get something they'd never had before: the legal power to enforce their will on every studio in Hollywood, and a man willing to use it. And he hated Betty Boop most of all. Man who made Betty his target. His name was Joseph Breen. In 1934, Hollywood was forced to strictly enforce the production code, better known as the Hays Code. A long list of rules dictating exactly what could appear on screen. No suggestive dancing, no sexual innuendo, no impure love. And Breen was the enforcer, handed the power to block any film in America that broke a single rule. He had the entire industry terrified, and almost no character on Earth violated his rules harder than Betty Boop. She wasn't a borderline case, she was suggestive dancing and innuendo. That was her whole identity. To Breen, she wasn't entertainment, she was a problem with a name. So he went after her more aggressively than nearly any other character in Hollywood. Not a studio, not a genre, a single cartoon flapper marked for personal destruction by the most powerful censor in the country. And he knew exactly where to aim. He went straight for the two things that made Betty Boop, Betty Boop. And Joseph Breen was only getting started. Her winks and her hips got banned. By Breen's next move was surgical. Every classic Betty Boop cartoon used to open the same way. Betty alone in the spotlight, winking at the audience, swaying her hips. Breen watched those openings and ruled them obscene, so he ordered them gone. The wink? Banned. The hip sway? Banned. The exact gestures that put her name on theater marquees were now illegal under the code. Think about the cruelty of that. Remember the very first facts on this list, the things that made Betty controversial in the first place. The sex appeal, the flapper edge, the adult wink. Those weren't just toned down, they were outlawed, one by one. And it didn't stop at the intro. Her wardrobe got longer and frumpier. The flapper dress swapped for a housewife's apron or a secretary's blouse. The garter vanished. The hoop earrings vanished. Her curls were tamed. Piece by piece, Breen didn't edit Betty Boop. He deleted her and built a safe, hollow replacement wearing her name. You can probably already guess what that did to the people who actually watched her. Censorship decision that destroyed Betty Boop. Here's the brutal irony. Betty's entire audience was adults. The grown men and women who came for the jazz, the edge, the flapper rebellion. Take all of that away, hand them a wholesome housewife in a long, modest skirt, and you've deleted the only reason anyone bought a ticket. So the adults left, and kids were never the real audience to begin with. The new, decent Betty was now stuck in the middle, appealing to absolutely no one. The series limped through the late 1930s, desperately trying to stay relevant and failing, until it was finally canceled in 1939. The studio didn't even give her a proper goodbye. The final entry in her own series is a cartoon Betty doesn't appear in at all. It was thrown together just to fulfill a contract. The censors had won, completely. They got their bans, their longer dresses, their cancellation. By 1939, Betty Boop was finished. The cartoons were gone. The audience was gone. The most famous flapper in America had been scrubbed off the screen for good. The censors had won. End of story. Except it wasn't, because the version they erased refused to stay dead. But they lost in the end. Think back to the very first image in this video. The Betty Boop on a coffee mug, the t-shirt, the phone case in the mall. Now look closely at the Betty printed on all of it. She's not wearing the long, modest dress the censors forced on her. She's not the tamed housewife. She's not the safe, hollow replacement Joseph Breen built. She's got the short skirt, the garter, the hoop earrings, the curls, the wink, the hips. Every single piece of Betty Boop merchandise on the planet, every poster, every mug, every collectible, every social media tribute celebrates the exact version that religious groups condemned, that Joseph Breen outlawed, that the censors spent years trying to scrub off the screen forever. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. That version shouldn't even exist anymore. Powerful people spent years deliberately erasing it. By every measure of their own time, they succeeded. They got the bans, the cancellation, the forgotten ending. But when marketers rediscovered Betty in the 1980s and turned her into a merchandising empire worth a fortune, they didn't reach for the approved version. Nobody wanted her. They reached straight back past 1934 and resurrected the flapper, the sex symbol, the rebel, the wink, the exact woman the censors had branded a threat to the nation. The decent Betty, the one they fought so hard to build, is the one nobody remembers. And the dangerous one, the one they tried to destroy, outlived her own creators, who never lived to see her become more famous than they ever dreamed. So here is the final fact, the one every kid missed and no adult forgets. They erased her from theaters. They changed her clothes. They canceled her cartoons. And the version of Betty Boop that history remembers, the only one anyone remembers, is the exact version those powerful people spent years trying to erase. Betty Boop didn't survive censorship. She outlived it. Which of these stopped you cold? Drop your number in the comments. And if this surprised you, wait until you hear what happened to the studio that created her. That story's coming next.